February 15, 1995, Raleigh, North Carolina. At about 1:30 in the morning, federal agents move toward an apartment where a man is believed to be online. The target is not armed. He is not hiding explosives. He is sitting behind a keyboard. His name is Kevin Mitnick. To the Justice Department, he is a fugitive computer hacker. To newspapers, he is one of the most wanted computer criminals in America. To parts of the hacker world, he is something else entirely. A legend, a myth, a warning about what happens when a curious kid realizes the weakest part of a machine is not the machine. It is the person answering the phone. This is the story of the kid who hacked America. The strange thing about Kevin Mitnick is that his story did not begin with the internet. Not really. It began with telephones, wires, switches, operator codes, long-distance systems, machines that ran inside buildings most people never entered. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, America's communications network was not a glowing map of websites and apps. It was a physical machine. It had offices, manuals, employees, badges, trash cans, habits. And if you understood the habits, you could make the machine do things. Phone freaks were not ordinary prank callers. They studied the phone system like a hidden city. They learned how calls moved. They learned which tones mattered. They learned how operators talked to each other. They learned which employee would believe a confident voice. For them, the telephone was not just a device, it was a door. Kevin Mitnick found that door young. He grew up in the San Fernando Valley near Los Angeles. His parents divorced when he was small. His mother raised him. As a teenager, he spent time around Monroe High School in Sepulveda and became fascinated with systems that were supposed to be closed. School computers, phone company equipment, telephone switching centers. The normal teenage fantasy is to be invisible. Kevin's version was stranger. He wanted to understand the system so well that the system could not see him. He was not the first hacker. That part matters. The title First Hacker is mostly mythology. There were phone freaks before him, programmers before him, computer crimes before him, and entire underground communities before his name became famous. But Kevin Mitnick became one of the first hackers America treated like a national character, a symbol, a monster to some, a folk hero to others. And that transformation started before most Americans even owned a modem. In 1989, only about 15% of US households reported having a computer. Of those home computers, only about 23% had a telephone modem. That means the world Mitnick entered was not yet a mass world. It was a smaller place, a place of terminals, university machines, corporate systems, and people who understood commands most of the country had never seen. That made it easier to exaggerate. It also made it easier to hide. Mitnick's first serious legal trouble came when he was still a teenager. In 1981, when he was 17, he was arrested for stealing computer manuals from a Pacific Bell switching center in Los Angeles. He was prosecuted as a juvenile and placed on probation. The object was almost comically boring to anyone outside the underground. Manuals, paper, documentation. But to someone like Mitnick, manuals were maps. They told you how a system thought. A year later, he was caught breaking into computers at the University of Southern California and spent time in custody. By then, the pattern was visible. Kevin was drawn to restricted systems not only because they held information, but because they had rules, and rules can be studied. The early stories around him grew fast. Some accounts said that, as a teenager, he used a computer and modem to break into a North American Air Defense Command computer. The claim would echo for years, because it sounded like the plot of war games, before war games had fully entered American paranoia. But many Mitnick stories live in the dangerous space between record, rumor, and newspaper legend. Some were documented, some were alleged, some were repeated so often they became part of the character. The verifiable core was simpler and more disturbing. Kevin Mitnick learned how institutions trusted people. He learned how an employee sounded when they belonged. He learned the right vocabulary. He learned when to be friendly and when to sound
Yes,
rushed.
I'd be happy to.
He learned that a password could be pulled from a person more easily than cracked from a machine. Later, this would be called social engineering. At the time, it was just the old art of confidence applied to new infrastructure. A call would come in. The person on the other end sounded like an employee, maybe a technician, maybe a supervisor, maybe someone from another office who knew just enough internal language to feel legitimate. The target would give a number, a code, a password, a path. Then the caller would move deeper. It was hacking without touching the keyboard first. That is why the Mitnick story became so hard to classify. If he had only been a burglar, the narrative would be easy. If he had only been a programmer, it would be easy. But his real skill sat between computers and people. He did not just enter systems, he entered the assumptions around them. In 1987, Mitnick was arrested on charges related to breaking into a computer at the Santa Cruz operation, a software company. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor, paid a fine, and was placed on probation. A year later, the situation became much more serious. In 1988, FBI agents arrested him on charges connected to Digital Equipment Corporation, one of the most important computer companies of its era. DEC built machines that sat between the age of mainframes and the age of personal computers. Its systems mattered to universities, companies, and technical communities. Its software was valuable. Its internal knowledge was not supposed to leave the building. Authorities accused Mitnick of stealing prototype operating system software from DEC. Officials at Digital later claimed millions of dollars in damages and said roughly $1 million worth of software had been taken. Mitnick was convicted. In July 1989, he was sentenced to a year in federal prison. At the sentencing, something unusual happened. One of his lawyers argued that Mitnick had an addiction to computers. Not greed, not violence, compulsion. The court took that seriously enough that after his release, he was placed in a residential treatment program. He was prohibited from touching a computer or modem. For most offenders, that kind of condition would be strange. For Mitnick, it was the point. The machine was not just the weapon, it was the temptation. During this period, the image of Mitnick hardened. Law enforcement saw a repeat offender who kept returning to systems he had been ordered to leave alone. Some journalists saw a new kind of criminal, one whose danger was difficult to explain to the public. Friends and supporters saw obsession, curiosity, and a punishment system that did not yet understand the culture it was trying to contain. Then he vanished. In November 1992, after federal agents searched his home, Mitnick dropped out of sight. Authorities believed he had violated probation by returning to computer and phone systems. A federal warrant followed. From then until 1995, he lived as a fugitive. This is where the story turns from crime into pursuit. The FBI was not chasing a man across highways. It was chasing signals, phone calls, cellular connections, modems, false identities, systems that could be bent to conceal where a call came from. Mitnick was accused of using cloned cellular phones to hide his location. Officials said he moved through the networks of technology companies and communication carriers. The names attached to the case would eventually include Motorola, Novell, Fujitsu, Sun Microsystems, Nokia, Pacific Bell, Netcom, The Well, and others. The government said he copied proprietary software. He admitted later to breaking into systems and stealing software belonging to several companies. He also admitted using social engineering, cloned cellular phones, sniffer programs, and hacker tools. He admitted to stealing emails, monitoring systems, impersonating employees, and using altered systems to store misappropriated programs. But his motives stayed difficult. The most frightening version of Mitnick was that he could steal financial data, trade secrets, and phone company knowledge, then sell it or weaponize it. Yet even the reporting at the time often noted something odd. There was no clear evidence that he was primarily driven by money. Investigators found data that could have been financially useful. Some reports said files contained more than 20,000 credit card numbers. but there was no evidence at that point that he had used those accounts. That uncertainty made him more fascinating, not less. A thief who steals for money is understandable. A hacker who steals to prove he can is harder to process. By July 1994, the New York Times described him as one of the nation's most wanted computer criminals. The article framed him as a man who combined technical skill with the old tricks of a grifter. It described social engineering in plain language. He could masquerade as a company executive on the phone and convince employees to give him passwords and codes. Then he could use those openings to copy software, read messages, or manipulate telephone systems. This was not just a Kevin Mitnick problem. It was an American infrastructure problem. In the early 1990s, companies were connecting more systems together. The internet was moving from research and academic spaces into commercial life. More people were getting online. More companies were depending on networks. But many security practices were still built for a slower world. A world where trust traveled by voice. A world where internal knowledge sounded like identity. If you sounded like you belonged, you often belonged. For Mitnick, that was enough. By 1994, the chase had become embarrassing for law enforcement. Mitnick had already been in and out of the justice system. He had been ordered away from computers. He had disappeared. He was accused of moving through corporate and communications networks, while the people hunting him struggled to place him physically in a room. He had become a kind of ghost in the wiring. Then, on Christmas Day 1994, he made the mistake that changed the case. The target was Tsutomu Shimomura, a computer security expert associated with the San Diego Supercomputer Center. Shimomura was not a random victim. He was technically skilled, well-connected, and personally offended. According to the official and press accounts that followed, Mitnick broke into Shimomura's computer, using a technique broadly described at the time as protocol spoofing, or IP spoofing. In simple terms, the intruder tricked one machine into trusting another machine it should not have trusted. The details were technical. The effect was personal. Files were taken, messages followed. The intrusion became a provocation. Shimomura decided to hunt the person who had entered his system. This is the part of the story that later became a duel in popular culture. The hacker and the computer security expert. The fugitive and the tracker. The cyber thief and the samurai. The reality was less cinematic and more procedural. Shimomura worked with telephone companies, internet providers, and federal investigators. They followed logs. They watched traffic. They traced cellular activity. They narrowed the search. The electronic net tightened. Mitnick continued using systems. He also appeared to taunt his pursuers. In one reported incident, a voicemail message was left for Shimomura, after earlier voice messages had been converted into audio files and placed online. The pursuit was no longer quiet. It had become a performance, with evidence leaking from every move. For a fugitive who depended on invisibility, attention was dangerous. In February 1995, investigators traced activity toward Raleigh, North Carolina. Shimomura worked from monitoring points. Telephone technicians and federal investigators used scanners to home in on the signal. The target was believed to be connecting through a computer modem tied to a cellular phone. That detail mattered because it turned the hunt into something physical. A digital signal had to end somewhere. A room, a building, an apartment. On February 15, 1995, agents arrested Kevin Mitnick in Raleigh after an intensive electronic manhunt. The Justice Department said the arrest followed a 2-week effort and led agents to his apartment. The New York Times described a 24-hour stakeout and said investigators moved after scanners helped determine that he had connected again to the internet. Inside the apartment, the myth became a person again. He was 31 years old. At a hearing after his arrest, Mitnick saw Shimomura face to face. The New York Times reported that he turned to him and said, "Hello, Tsutomu. I respect your skills." It is almost too neat a line. That is why it lasted. In one sentence, the chase became a game again. But outside the courtroom, the government did not treat it like a game. Mitnick was charged, detained, and eventually moved through a long legal process. In 1995, the Justice Department said he was a well-known hacker, and federal fugitive wanted for violating probation. It said he had been convicted in 1988 in Los Angeles for stealing computer programs and breaking into corporate networks. It also said he was alleged to have attacked corporate and communications carriers in several states, causing damage and stealing proprietary information. Those were allegations at the moment of arrest. The later plea made parts of the case concrete. In March 1999, Mitnick pleaded guilty to 4 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of computer fraud, and 1 count of illegally intercepting a wire communication. In August 1999, he was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison. He had also previously received an additional 22 months for violating supervised release and possessing cloned cellular phones when he was arrested. The combined sentence was 68 months. The government called it the longest sentence given to any computer hacker at the time. Restitution was also complicated. Prosecutors and victim companies described losses in the millions, tied to lost licensing fees, marketing delays, research and development, and repairing compromised systems. But the judge ordered Mitnick to pay just over $4,125 in restitution, citing his limited future earnings. The court rejected his claim that no restitution should be ordered, and also rejected his claim that the government overstated victim losses. The result satisfied almost no one. To prosecutors, he was a serious computer criminal finally held accountable. To supporters, he was a scapegoat for a young internet society that needed a villain. The Free Kevin movement grew around that belief. Supporters argued his punishment was excessive. They argued the media had inflated his danger. They argued that the public was being asked to fear a man because most people did not understand what hacking actually was. Some pointed to the way authorities restricted his access to phones and computers as proof that myth had entered policy. Mitnick himself later said officials treated him as if he had almost magical powers. One of the most famous claims attached to the case was that authorities believed he could start a nuclear war by whistling into a phone. Whether told literally, exaggerated, or repeated as courtroom folklore, the story captured the central absurdity of the era. America was terrified of the network. It did not yet know how to measure the people who understood it, so it imagined them as wizards. That fear was not completely irrational. The systems were vulnerable. The companies were careless. The phone network had weaknesses. The internet had trust assumptions that could be abused. Employees really could be tricked. Proprietary source code really could be copied. A persistent intruder really could cause damage without touching a locked door. But fear changed the scale of the story. Kevin Mitnick became larger than Kevin Mitnick. He became the face of an entire unknown territory. At the center of that territory was social engineering. The term sounds technical, but the idea is old. A person can be made to help an attacker if the attacker understands pressure, authority, urgency, and trust. The password is not stolen from the system. It is handed over. The door is not broken. Someone opens it. Mitnick did not invent this. Con artists had used it forever. Spies had used it forever. Salesmen, imposters, and manipulators had used it forever. What made Mitnick important was the setting. He proved that the same human weakness that worked in a hotel lobby or a bank office also worked inside a digital network. A company could buy better machines. It could install better software. It could lock the computer room. Then one employee could answer one phone call and give away the path inside. That is why his story aged so strangely well. The machines changed. The weakness stayed. After sentencing, Mitnick remained under severe restrictions. When he was released from federal prison in January 2000, he was not simply free to return to ordinary life online. His supervised release limited his access to computers, software, wireless communications, passwords, cellular codes, and encryption devices. The conditions reflected the fear that surrounded him. For a period, the only communication technology he could own was a landline telephone. Think about that for a moment. In January 2000, the internet was no longer a niche system. It had become cultural infrastructure. Websites were on billboards. Email was normal. Search engines were reshaping how people found information. .com companies were everywhere. And one of the most famous hackers in America was released into that world with almost no access to it. He had become famous for entering the future too early. Then he was legally kept out of it. When his restrictions eventually eased, the next phase of his life began. Mitnick became a security consultant, public speaker, and author. He wrote about deception, intrusion, privacy, and the human side of security. He built a career teaching companies how people like him got inside. The same techniques that once made him a fugitive became, in a different context, a service. This transformation is sometimes told too cleanly. Black hat becomes white hat. Criminal becomes consultant. Society learns. Everyone moves on. But the Mitnick story is not that tidy. The crimes were real. He admitted to federal offenses. Companies were compromised. Proprietary software was taken. People spent time and money repairing systems and investigating damage. At the same time, the panic was also real. Some public descriptions of his abilities were exaggerated. Some losses were contested. Some of the fear around him was less about what he had done and more about what people imagined a hacker could do. Both things can be true. He broke the law, and America turned him into a myth. That myth arrived at exactly the right time. In the early 1980s, hacker culture was strange and cinematic. War games had given the public an image of the teenager at a modem who nearly causes nuclear war. In corporate offices, computers were becoming essential. In government, networks were becoming security problems. By the 1990s, the internet was growing fast enough that even non-technical people could feel something changing. Then came Kevin Mitnick. He had the perfect ingredients for a national story. He started young. He understood phones. He used aliases. His handle, Condor, sounded like a spy novel. He had been arrested before. He escaped supervision. He allegedly moved through companies whose products shaped the communications world. He was tracked by another expert after a Christmas Day intrusion. He was arrested in the dark, in an apartment, by agents following signals through the air. If someone had invented him, it would have seemed too obvious. But he was not invented. He was assembled from real events, disputed claims, law enforcement pressure, media language, hacker folklore, and the public's fear of machines it had only just begun to depend on. That is why the title, "The Kid Who Hacked America," works only if you understand what America means in the sentence. He did not hack the whole country. He did not bring down the government. He did not empty every bank account. The strongest versions of those claims belong to panic, not fact. What he hacked was America's confidence. He showed that phone companies did not fully control their phone systems. Technology companies did not fully control their source code. Law enforcement did not fully understand the territory it was entering. Courts did not know how to sentence a person whose power seemed to come from knowledge. Journalists did not know how to describe technical crime without turning it into magic. And ordinary people were about to live inside networks they did not understand. In that sense, Mitnick was not an exception. He was a preview. The systems he touched were early versions of a problem that now surrounds everyone. Password resets, help desks, SIM swaps, phishing emails, fake support calls, data brokers, authentication codes, corporate logins. The attacker no longer needs to be a legendary hacker with a modem in an apartment. Sometimes the attacker just needs to sound right for 30 seconds. This is the uncomfortable legacy of Kevin Mitnick. Not the source code, not the cloned phones, not even the manhunt. The legacy is the realization that security is not a wall. It is a conversation, and conversations can be manipulated. After his release, Mitnick often framed his old hacking as curiosity rather than greed. He described himself more like an electronic joyrider than a conventional thief. That distinction mattered to him. It mattered to supporters too. But to victims, curiosity did not erase intrusion. A joyride still starts
What
with
do
a
you do with
stolen
someone who
vehicle.
breaks into
A
systems?
copied file is still copied. A compromised system is still compromised. The moral line is not erased because the motive is interesting. But motive does explain why the story held people's attention for so long. If he had been stealing for money, the ending would be simple: prison, release, restitution, consultant. But Mitnick's story asks a more modern question. What do you do with someone who breaks into systems because the systems exist? What do you do with a mind that treats every rule as a puzzle? What do you do when the puzzle belongs to a company, a phone network, a court order, or the federal government? In the 1990s, the answer was prison and prohibition. Later, the answer became employment. That is the arc that mirrors the internet itself. First, hackers were outsiders. Then they were criminals. Then they were consultants. Then every company needed them. The same society that feared people like Mitnick eventually built an industry around hiring people who could think like him, only under contract. The outlaw became a job description. Kevin Mitnick died in July 2023 at age 59 after pancreatic cancer. By then, the world that once made him seem impossible had disappeared. The internet was no longer a separate place people visited. It was the layer underneath banking, work, hospitals, elections, dating, maps, cars, homes, and war. Children carried devices more powerful than the systems that made Mitnick famous. Companies paid security teams to do legally what once triggered federal raids. And social engineering did not fade. It scaled. That is the part of the story that does not end with the arrest in Raleigh. It does not end with the 1999 sentence. It does not end with the 2000 release. It does not even end with the security career or the obituary. The boy in the phone system found a flaw that was never only technical.
Hello.
He found the human being inside the machine, and that machine is still answering.
Are you there?